Putting the supplementary order paper by Dr. Norman to remove these clauses. Thank you.
The Honourable David Cunliffe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there's an old rule in politics which says that when we politicians are sick of saying something for the umpteenth time, the folks out there in the real world are only just starting to pick up on it. And I was reminded of that this week when I was going to my child's school, and a teacher grabbed me by the arm and said, "Have you heard what that government's doing? They're planning to sell off our energy companies." I said, "No," and she said, "How can they possibly do that? Most people don't want that to happen." And I said, "You're absolutely right." But there's no surprise on that one, because that lot have had that evil plan in their mind for some time. Mr. Chairman, this is a very bad idea for a number of reasons. Firstly, it makes no financial or economic sense. Secondly, it makes no strategic economic development sense. Thirdly, it is absolutely rubbish social policy. And fourthly, ultimately, the politics are going to come back and bite this government where it hurts, in the ballot box. Mr. Speaker, the essence of this bill is in fact contained in the title to Part 1. Provisions for companies to cease to be state enterprises and to become companies. These will not be SOEs anymore. They won't have the social obligations. They won't have the treaty obligations. They won't have the same obligations to be good corporate citizens. They won't have a no surprises rule for the smiling minister there who knows what he's doing to the public of New Zealand. They won't have the power to direct, the reserve power that governments use in extreme circumstances to put the national interest first. Do we believe that these companies should be sold? No. Do we believe the government has an obligation to the people of New Zealand to put their interests first? Yes. So why does this not make sense? Well, look, the first reasons are so obviously financial. Mr. Speaker, privatisation makes the government's fiscal deficit worse. Let's say that again. It makes the fiscal deficit worse, not better. Why? Because the government saves about $260 million in borrowing costs and it loses $360 million in dividends on average. Minus 100. What is hard for people to get about that? Minus 100 a year. That is how much the fiscal deficit will worsen as a result of this bill. But it's not as if the fiscal deficit is the biggest problem in the first place. The OECD, the IMF, the rating agencies have all told us the same thing. It's private debt that's high, not public debt. That shows up in the current account deficit and it shows up in our net international liabilities. So, fair question. I see Mr. Ryle smiling to himself because he thinks he might know the answer to this one. What happens to private debt? Well, it goes up. It goes up because there will be borrowing from foreigners who are investing in these companies to buy up their share of it, and the dividends to those new owners will add to the current account deficit each and every year. So this is a lose-lose. Not only is the government's deficit worse, the country's deficit is worse. There is no financial reason to sell. Third fact on the finance line. The rate of return on the 3 energy generators is averaged around about 15% per annum on a total shareholder basis. That's divs plus capital gains, 15%, pretty tidy. Mighty River, 43%, wonderful. Crown cost of capital, only 5%, probably lower at the moment, closer to 4%. Why would you sell an asset that's averaging 15% when you're borrowing at 4% and keeping the difference and not having to tax people? Answer, because it's never been a financial decision. This is a political decision because the National Party is linked to people that are going to get very rich out of this. The ticket clippers, the merchant bankers, the lawyers and the accountants, the vested interests who are snuffing at the trough of the National Party. This is jobs for mates, and it's wrong. It is wrong, Mr. Chairman. It is wrong, Mr. Chairman.
The Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr. Chairman, so it makes no financial sense. It's explainable only in terms of who gets what. Which brings us to the famous mum and dad provisions. Am I free to dine at the Ritz? One of the oldest issues in economic philosophy. Well, if you're not regulated, technically you are. But not if you've got no money. Mum and dad already own these shares, Mr. Chairman. They're being asked to pay again for what they already own when they've got no money. When they've got no money. When people in our constituencies are having trouble feeding their kids, there's 200,000 children growing up in poverty. Are those families going to be able to go and buy a slice of Mighty River Power? Not on your Nelly. Not on your Nelly. So this is not a privatisation to Kiwi mums and dads. This is a privatisation to some rich Kiwi mums and dads in the pocket of the current government who are selling the birthright of all of us for their political gain. Mr. Speaker, it's wrong. Mr. Speaker, from an economic development point of view, has nobody told these clowns we face a fossil fuel crisis in the next few years? Has nobody told them the price of oil is going to go up 50% in the next 3 or 4? And has nobody told these people that climate change is happening, that the price of carbon will rise? And was there ever a more stupid time to sell a controlling interest in your own energy system? You know, we're blessed here. We have 70% of our energy produced by hydro. We have a 90% renewable energy profile. On its way to 95, I hope one day 100. I hope one day we'll be able to stand up and say we're carbon neutral. Why would we prejudice that strategy by flogging off the engines of development to overseas shareholders who care nothing for New Zealand Inc. but care a lot about the dividends they can extract? Why would we do that? What value does it add to take perfectly well-run state enterprises and turn them loose as mixed ownership companies? My colleague Clayton Cosgrove repeated the testimony of the chair of One SOE, I think it was Joan Withers, who said, we will not change behaviour if we are governing a partially privatised entity. We do best practice directing now. That is our legal obligation. For there to be an upside, the government would effectively be saying the current directors are not doing their job and are therefore culpable. That's rubbish. These are well-run companies. They turn a tidy profit for the taxpayer. It makes no strategic sense whatsoever to sell them. The counterfactual is Norway. A country about our size, they created a future fund for their oil deposits. They have kept their state assets, and they have become one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And they would not be doing what this government is doing, nor would the Danes, nor would the Finns that Jerry Brownlee is so fond of. They invest in innovation, they build their assets, and they keep them. And they keep them. Mr. Speaker, this makes no social sense. I'll close with that. We've already noted New Zealanders already own these companies. We've already noted that most New Zealanders can't afford to buy them twice. We ask the question, why then is this happening? Mr. Speaker, it is explainable only for the saddest of reasons. That National went out on a limb to please what is politely called one of its own core constituencies. In the language of the streets, their rich mates. The lawyers, the accountants, the Goldman Sachs, the Merrill Lynches of the world, heard them before? I wonder why that is. The people who describe their customers as muppets. And this government is selling New Zealand down the river with an irreversible change because it has mistakenly thought that they would harbour a bit of money. But they will lose more dividends than it saves them. They are creating a fiction out of a future investment fund when we all know the government's got capital anyway. And one of the members opposite, Mr. Chairman, asked, how would Labor fund capital investment? I think it was Mr Goldsmith. And the answer is Labor's last fiscals had net debt paid off before the government's own. We did it through tax reform that was pro-growth and fair, and that plan would work. Mr Chairman, in summary, no financial sense, no strategic sense, no social sense.
I call Gareth Hughes.
Kia ora, Mr Chair. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Kia ora. It's good to